Do be careful with the pheasant, Clara, you nearly spilled it on Lord Harwick's sleeve.
Cecilia did not look at her when she said it. That was the particular art of it, the correction delivered sideways, lightly, as one might remark upon the weather, while her eyes remained fixed upon her fiancé with an expression of devoted attention. The words were not meant to wound. They never were. They simply did. Lord Harwick chuckled softly.
No harm done, my dear.
There would have been.
Cecilia replied, and lifted her wine glass with a smile that had nothing to do with Clara. Clara straightened. Reset her expression. Moved on. 32 candles burned along the center of the Ashford dining table, arranged in silver holders she had polished that very morning with her own hands. The crystal caught their light and scattered it across the ceiling. The linen was pressed. The flowers were fresh. Every detail of this evening had been assembled with invisible labor, and not one of the 40 guests now laughing and eating knew whose hands had done it. They would not have thought to ask. She was reaching past Arabella to collect an empty dish when her younger sister turned, looked at her directly for the first time all evening, and said with perfect cheerfulness, "You have a smudge on your chin, Clara. Soot, I think." From the kitchen. 2 gentlemen nearby heard. One coughed. The other studied his plate with sudden interest. Clara said nothing. She touched her chin briefly with the back of her wrist, adjusted her grip on the dish, and continued toward the kitchen door. Behind her she heard Arabella laugh, the light, unthinking laugh of a girl who had not yet learned that casual cruelty leaves marks on the person who delivers it as much as the one who receives it. Or perhaps she had learned and simply did not care. Clara set the dish on the kitchen table and stood for a moment in the relative mercy of the empty room. She was 23 years old. She was the daughter of a baron. She had been educated by the same governess as her sisters, had read the same books, spoken French with the same imperfect accent, practiced the same pieces on the same pianoforte in the same drawing room on the same grey Derbyshire mornings. And tonight she was carrying pheasant while her sisters wore pearls. You will not feel what you are feeling, she told herself, the same instruction she had been repeating since 6 o'clock that evening, when she had fastened the last button on Cecilia's gown and watched her sister examine her own reflection with the serene satisfaction of a woman who has never once doubted her own worth. She smoothed her dark muslin, lifted the next dish, and returned to the dining room. It was then that the door at the far end opened. The shift was subtle, a change in posture among the seated guests, a murmur moving down the table like wind across water. Lord Harwick rose slightly, his expression assuming the alertness of a man surprised by an honor he had quietly hoped for. Clara looked up. He stood in the doorway in a coat of deep charcoal, unhurried, as though the room had been waiting for him rather than the other way around. Tall, dark-eyed, with the particular stillness of a man who had long ago stopped needing to announce himself. His gaze moved across the assembled company, calm, assessing, faintly removed. She did not know who he was. She only knew that every candle in the room seemed suddenly to lean toward him. "Your Grace." Lord Harwick extended his hand with undisguised pleasure. "I confess I had not dared hope you would come. I am a man of my word, Harwick." The visitor's voice was low and even, the kind that did not need volume to fill a room. "When I say I will attend, I attend." "Your Grace." Clara absorbed the information quietly from the sideboard, where she was rearranging the dessert service with hands that had gone slightly unsteady. A duke, then. She did not know which one, and it did not matter. Men of that rank moved through rooms like weather, noticed by everyone, belonging to no one in particular, and entirely indifferent to the smaller creatures caught in their passing. Lord Harwick led him to the empty chair 3 places from Cecilia's left. Cecilia straightened almost imperceptibly. Arabella's eyes had gone wide with the transparent excitement of a girl who had not yet mastered the art of concealing her interest in handsome men. Clara lifted the wine decanter and moved down the table. She had developed, over the course of the evening, a careful and systematic blindness, filling glasses without looking at faces, collecting dishes without meeting eyes. It was a practical mercy. If she did not look at her sister's expressions, she could not fully catalogue the quality of their ease, their comfort, their absolute assumption that the world would continue arranging itself pleasantly on their behalf. She reached the Duke's glass. She poured. And then, with the particular misfortune of a woman who had been so careful all evening, she looked up. He was already looking at her. Not with the habitual, unseeing glance of a man acknowledging a servant. Not with embarrassment. Simply looking. Directly and quietly, with an expression she could not immediately name. Clara dropped her gaze at once and moved on. By the third course she had persuaded herself it was nothing. A coincidence of timing. The natural tendency of the eye to follow movement. She was, after all, the only person in the room currently moving. By the fourth course she was considerably less certain. She felt it rather than saw it, the atmospheric pressure of sustained attention from someone making no effort to disguise it. She crossed to the sideboard. She returned to the table. Each time, without intending to, she became aware of precisely where he sat, the way one becomes aware of a fire in a cold room, peripherally, without looking directly at the flame. She risked a glance. He was listening to the gentleman on his left, expression attentive, posture composed. But his eyes moved. Found her. Held a moment too long. At the head of the table, Cecilia had gone very still. Her smile remained in place, but something behind it had shifted, a subtle tightening, like frost forming on still water. She had noticed. And Clara, who had spent a lifetime reading the weather of her sister's moods, felt the first cold edge of it reach her from across the room. Clara Ashford had not always carried dishes. There had been a time, not so distant that she had forgotten it, but worn smooth enough by repetition that it had acquired the quality of something half-imagined, when she had sat at tables rather than served them. When she had been, if not precisely cherished, at least counted among the daughters of the house rather than its most economical convenience. It had ended the way most quiet injustices end. Not with a single blow but with a long series of small surrenders, each one reasonable in isolation, each one impossible to object to without appearing petty or ungrateful, until one morning she woke to discover that the sum of all those small surrenders was her entire life. The inheritance had been the first and most significant. Her grandmother, her father's mother, a sharp-tongued woman of considerable independence, had left Clara £400 upon her death. It was not a fortune. But it was enough for a modest season. Enough to purchase 2 decent gowns, secure an introduction or 2, and present herself to the world as something other than a burden on her family's diminishing resources. She had been 17 when her grandmother died. She had never seen the money. She discovered its existence and its disappearance entirely by accident, 2 years later, when she came upon her father's old correspondence while helping her mother sort his papers after his illness. A solicitor's letter. A transfer of funds. A date that corresponded precisely with the month Cecilia had debuted in Bath in a gown of pale gold silk and a set of pearl earrings Clara had been told were a gift from an admiring aunt. She had stood holding the letter for a long time. Then she had folded it carefully, replaced it in the drawer, and gone downstairs to help prepare supper. She had not spoken of it. To speak of it would have required a confrontation she lacked the weapons for, her mother's particular genius being that she conducted every injustice with such calm practicality that to protest it was to seem hysterical, ungrateful, or simply difficult. "You are the sensible one, Clara," her mother had said, more than once, with the tone of a woman conferring a compliment. "Your sisters require more management. You have always been self-sufficient." Self-sufficient. The word for a horse that does not need to be fed. The word for a room that requires no heating. The word for a daughter one need not worry about because she has made her peace with receiving nothing. Miss Clara, cook had said to her once, in the kitchen, with the careful gentleness of a woman who sees more than she is paid to notice, "You deserve better than this house gives you." Clara had smiled and said, "We all of us make do, Mrs. Peel." But she had thought about it for a week afterward. Cecilia's engagement had been announced on a Tuesday morning in October, over breakfast, with the theatrical timing her sister had always possessed. "Lord Harwick has spoken to Mamma," she said, setting down her teacup with a precise and satisfied click. "It is settled." Arabella had shrieked with a delight entirely disproportionate to her personal investment in the matter and thrown her arms around Cecilia's neck. Their mother had pressed her handkerchief to the corner of one eye, a gesture Clara had never quite determined was genuine, and declared it the happiest day in recent memory. Clara had said, "I am very glad for you, Cecilia," and meant approximately half of it. Lord Harwick was wealthy, steady, and twice Cecilia's age. He was not unkind. He was also not interesting, and Clara privately suspected her sister knew this and had calculated that an uninteresting husband of sufficient fortune was a more reliable arrangement than an interesting one of uncertain means. Cecilia had always been practical beneath the performance. "We shall have the engagement dinner within the month," their mother announced, already reaching for her correspondence. 40 guests at minimum. The Alderton family, the Pembrokes, certainly the Carstairs. "And we shall need new gowns," Arabella said immediately. "Naturally." Clara waited. She was accustomed to waiting through conversations of this kind to discover where, if anywhere, she featured in the plans being laid. "Clara!" Her mother looked up with the expression of a woman solving a practical problem. "You shall manage the menu with Mrs. Peel and oversee the table arrangements. You have always had a steadier hand for these things than your sisters." "Of course, Mamma." It was not until 3 days before the dinner that the other matter arose. Martha, the housemaid, slipped on the wet kitchen steps and broke her wrist on a Wednesday afternoon. The surgeon was sent for. Martha was put to bed. And that evening Clara's mother appeared in the doorway of the small sitting room where Clara was writing the dinner seating plan and delivered the verdict with the calm of a woman announcing a minor schedule adjustment. "You will serve at table on Friday evening." Clara set down her pen. "I beg your pardon, Mamma. We cannot afford to hire a girl on 3 days' notice. Not with what this dinner has already cost us." Her mother's tone did not invite discussion. "You are capable. You know the house. It is a practical solution." "I am your daughter," Clara said. Quietly. Carefully. The way one sets down something fragile. Her mother looked at her with an expression that was not unkind and not cruel and was somehow worse than either. "Yes," she said. "And your sister's dinner must succeed. You understand that?" From the hallway, Arabella's voice drifted in. She had been listening, as she always listened, from just beyond the door. "At least you shall not have to make conversation with anyone dull, Clara. Think of it as a mercy." Then the sound of her light footsteps retreating. Then laughter, brief and bright, already moving on to something else. Clara sat alone in the small sitting room for a long time after her mother left. Then she folded the seating plan, rose from the chair, and went to find her darkest dress. The guests had moved to the drawing room for tea when Clara began clearing the last of the dinner table. The candles had burned low. The room was quieter now, the particular exhausted quiet of a space that had held too many people for too many hours and was slowly returning to itself. She was stacking the final dessert plates when she heard footsteps behind her. Not the light, purposeful steps of a housemaid. Heavier. Deliberate. She turned. The Duke of Kingston stood at the far end of the table, still in his charcoal coat, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. He was not approaching with the hurried air of a man who had wandered in by accident. He had come here directly, and they both understood it. Clara set the plates down carefully. "Your Grace." She dipped into a correct curtsy, her eyes lowered. "I believe the company has removed to the drawing room. If you have need of anything I can." "I did not come for tea," he said. She looked up. He was closer than she had realized, having crossed the room with quiet efficiency while she was speaking. In the diminished candlelight his expression was easier to read than it had been across a crowded dinner table, and what she read there was not the languid curiosity of a man amusing himself. It was something more deliberate than that. More considered. "I find myself at an unusual disadvantage," he said, "for a man who was introduced to every person at that table tonight." Clara said nothing. "I was not introduced to you," he said. A beat of silence. Outside, a carriage shifted on the gravel. She began. "Kingston." Cecilia's voice arrived in the room before she did, bright, warm, perfectly calibrated to the occasion. She appeared in the doorway in her ivory silk, her expression arranged into a smile of charming surprise, as though she had stumbled upon a delightful coincidence rather than what Clara knew with absolute certainty was a deliberate interception. "We wondered where you had gone." Cecilia moved forward without hesitation. "I see you have met our girl. Our girl. She assists us when we entertain," Cecilia continued, stepping neatly between them with the practiced ease of a woman who has been managing rooms since childhood. "We are very fond of her. Now, you simply must come and tell Lord Harwick more about the Ashmore estate. He has been speaking of nothing else since you arrived." She touched the Duke's arm lightly. A steering gesture. Graceful and absolute. The Duke looked at Clara once more over Cecilia's shoulder. Clara looked back at him with a face that revealed nothing, because she had spent 23 years perfecting that particular expression. Then Cecilia led him away, and the room was empty, and Clara stood alone between the guttered candles and the stacked plates, feeling something cold and clarifying move through her chest. Our girl. She picked up the plates and carried them to the kitchen without making a sound. She found Clara in the linen room at 11:30. The guests had gone. Their mother had retired with a headache and a satisfied expression. Arabella had fallen asleep in the parlor chair like a child. The house had settled into its nighttime silence, and Clara was folding tablecloths alone when the door opened and Cecilia entered, still in her silk, her pearl earrings catching the lamplight. She closed the door behind her. "You may thank me," she said pleasantly, "for sparing you an embarrassing situation this evening." Clara continued folding. "I do not know to what you refer, Cecilia." "Do you not?" It was not a question. Cecilia moved to the small window and stood with her arms crossed, studying Clara with the cool assessment she usually reserved for household accounts. "The Duke of Kingston is James Wyndham. He holds 3 estates, a seat in the Lords, and an income that would make Lord Harwick look modest. He is also," she added, her voice dropping a degree, "precisely the kind of man who should not be standing in a darkened dining room speaking to a girl who was carrying dishes an hour earlier." "I was not." "You were." Cecilia's pleasantness did not waver, which was somehow more alarming than anger would have been. "And I corrected it. Discreetly." "You are welcome." Clara set down the tablecloth and turned to face her sister fully. "I see," she said. "I hope that you do." Cecilia held her gaze without difficulty. "You are a sensible woman, Clara. More sensible than you sometimes allow yourself to behave. The Duke is here as Lord Harwick's guest. He moves in circles that have nothing to do with you. If he showed you some passing curiosity this evening, it was precisely that, passing. Men of his position are occasionally diverted by the unusual. It means nothing and it will come to nothing, and any encouragement on your part would result in consequences considerably more unpleasant for you than for him." Clara said, very quietly, "And if I were to disagree with your assessment?" Something shifted in Cecilia's expression. The pleasantness remained, but beneath it something sharpened, a blade behind glass. "Then I would remind you," she said, "that this house, this dinner, this family's standing, all of it depends upon my marriage proceeding well. Lord Harwick values Kingston's regard. I will not have anything, or anyone, introduce unnecessary complications into the next several months. She paused. "Do you understand me, Clara?" The lamp between them flickered. Clara understood her perfectly. She had understood her sisters her entire life, understood their architecture, their calculations, the precise measurements of their self-interest dressed as concern. What was different, standing in that linen room at 11:30, was that for the first time in a very long while she found she did not particularly care. "Good night, Cecilia," she said, and returned to her folding. She had not expected to see him again. Or rather, she had instructed herself not to expect it, which was a different thing entirely, and considerably less effective. For days after the engagement dinner, on a grey Thursday morning, Clara walked to the Ashford market alone. This was not unusual. She did the household shopping more often than not, her mother having discovered years ago that Clara neither overspent nor was distracted by the milliner's window in the way that Arabella invariably was. She was examining a basket of late autumn apples, testing them for firmness with the serious attention of a woman working within a strict budget, when a voice to her left said, "The ones on the far side are better." She turned. The Duke of Kingston stood 2 feet away in a plain dark greatcoat, without attendants, without ceremony, looking very much like a man who had arranged to be exactly where he was. Clara looked at him. Then at the apples. Then back at him. "Your Grace," she said, "do you make a habit of advising strangers on their market purchases?" "Only when the stranger appears to be making an error," he said. "The far ones have had more sun. You can tell by the color near the stem." A pause. Clara reached across and selected one of the apples he had indicated. Examined it. It was, she was frustrated to discover, noticeably better. "You were not introduced to me at the dinner," he said, without preamble. "Your sister introduced you as household staff. You are not household staff." "I was carrying dishes," Clara said carefully. "You were also," he said, "the most observant person in the room. I watched you notice things that the other 40 guests entirely missed." He paused. "I find that considerably more interesting than anything that was said aloud all evening." Clara set the apple in her basket. Her pulse was behaving in a manner she found professionally inconvenient. "You are very direct, Your Grace," she said. "I have found that indirectness wastes a great deal of time." He fell into step beside her as she moved to the next stall, with the comfortable ease of a man who had decided something and was no longer deliberating. "Tell me your name. Your actual name. Not the one your sister offered." "Clara Ashford," she said. "Daughter of the late Baron Ashford." Something registered in his expression, a quiet recalibration. "Miss Ashford," he said, "I owe you an apology for not having secured a proper introduction at dinner." "You owe me nothing, Your Grace." "Nevertheless." He stopped walking and faced her, and his expression was entirely serious. "May I call upon you, Miss Ashford?" The market moved around them, voices, carts, the smell of bread and cold air. Clara looked at him, at the steadiness of his gaze, at the complete absence of condescension or performance, and felt something dangerous stir beneath her careful composure. "I do not know," she said honestly. It was the most truthful thing she had said to anyone in months. She found them on a Sunday. She had not been looking for anything in particular. Her mother had asked her to clear out the old writing desk in the upper hallway, a piece of furniture that had belonged to her father and had sat untouched since his death 2 years prior, accumulating letters, receipts, and the general sediment of a household's unanswered correspondence. Clara worked through it methodically, sorting papers into stacks, setting aside items of potential importance. She was nearly finished when her hand found the false bottom. She had not known there was a false bottom. It was shallow, barely 2 inches, and contained a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon she recognized as having once belonged to her own sewing box. She untied it. The first letter was from a Mr. Edward Calloway, dated for years prior, addressed to her. She had never received it. The second was from the same gentleman, 3 weeks later. Also addressed to her. Also never received. There were 6 letters from Mr. Calloway in total, each one progressively more confused, the final one stiffly formal, a withdrawal. A man who had written repeatedly without reply and drawn the only conclusion available to him. Clara remembered Mr. Calloway. She had met him at the Pembroke summer gathering. He had been kind, quietly funny, and had spoken to her for nearly an hour about nothing in particular in the way that meant everything. She had waited afterward, weeks, then months, and heard nothing. She had concluded he had lost interest. She had concluded incorrectly. Beneath Calloway's letters were 2 others. These were not addressed to her. They were from a solicitor. And they concerned, in precise legal language, the transfer of a bequest of £400, left by the late Mrs. Ashford Sr. to her granddaughter Clara, into the general household account. Authorized not by her father, as she had assumed from the earlier letter she had found, but by her mother. Her mother's signature was at the bottom of the authorization. Clara sat on the floor of the hallway for a long time. The house was quiet around her. Somewhere downstairs she could hear Arabella at the pianoforte, picking through a melody with the unhurried ease of a girl who had never sat on a cold floor holding the paper evidence of her own erasure. She had always known. In the shapeless, unexamined way one knows things one is not ready to hold directly, she had always understood that she had been managed rather than loved, redirected rather than considered. She had told herself it was circumstance. The family's finances. Her sister's greater need. The reasonable sacrifices of the sensible one. But there was nothing reasonable on the papers in her hands. This had been deliberate. Consistent. Decided. She pressed the letters flat against her knee and felt, rising through the long-trained composure, through the careful silence and the folded tablecloths and the dark muslin and the years of swallowed words, something she had not permitted herself in a very long time. Anger. Clean and total and entirely her own. She gathered the letters carefully. Stood. And did not put them back. The Pembrokes' drawing-room was everything the Ashford house pretended to be, warm, well-staffed, and entirely without financial anxiety visible in its furnishings. 40 candles burned without anyone having counted them. The fire was generous. The tea was hot. Clara had almost not come. She had stood in front of her modest blue gown that morning with the letters from the writing desk still present in her mind like a low sound one cannot stop hearing, and she had thought seriously about sending her apologies to Mrs. Pembroke and spending the afternoon alone. Then she had put on the blue gown and come anyway. She was tired of making herself small. She had been there perhaps 20 minutes, speaking with old Mrs. Carstairs about nothing consequential, when she felt the familiar atmospheric shift she had come to associate with one specific presence. She did not turn immediately. She allowed Mrs. Carstairs to finish her sentence. Then she turned. The Duke of Kingston was crossing the room toward her with the unhurried directness of a man who had identified where he was going and saw no reason to obscure it. Behind him, across the room, she was peripherally aware of Cecilia's conversation faltering, a half-second interruption in the bright social rhythm her sister maintained as naturally as breathing. "Miss Ashford." He bowed correctly. "I had hoped you might be here." "Your Grace." She curtsied. "I was not aware you were acquainted with the Pembrokes." "I am acquainted with most families in this county," he said, and the faint dryness in his tone made clear he did not consider this an unqualified pleasure. "Though I find some gatherings considerably more worthwhile than others." Mrs. Carstairs made a small, delighted sound and discovered an urgent need to speak with someone across the room. Clara and the Duke were, functionally, alone. "You did not answer my question," he said. "At the market. Whether I might call upon you." "I recall," Clara said. "I told you I did not know. Have you reached a conclusion?" She looked at him steadily. I have been occupied with other matters. So I gathered. He said it gently, without pressure, and she understood that he was giving her room, that this man who could command any room he entered was deliberately making himself unhurried on her behalf. It undid something in her chest that she had not realized was still tightly held. "You may call," she said quietly. "If you still wish to." "I still wish to," he said, without hesitation. Around them the room had rearranged itself in the subtle way rooms do when something significant occurs within them, conversations angled slightly inward, eyes moving and moving away, the quiet recalibration of social observers noting that the Duke of Kingston had spent the better part of half an hour with the unremarkable middle Ashford daughter and appeared entirely content to remain there. Across the room, Cecilia's smile had not moved in 7 minutes. The power in the room had shifted. Clara felt it, delicate and new, like the first morning after a long frost. Something had cracked open that could not be closed again. They were waiting for her. She knew it before she removed her coat. The particular quality of silence in the Ashford hallway, too deliberate, too contained, announced itself as clearly as raised voices would have. Clara handed her coat to the housemaid, smoothed her gloves, and walked into the sitting room. Her mother sat in the high-backed chair by the fire. Cecilia stood at the window. "Close the door, please," her mother said. Clara closed it. Remained standing. "Mrs. Pembroke's gathering was well attended, I understand," her mother began, in the tone she used for conversation she had already concluded before they started. "Several people have already remarked upon it to Cecilia." "I imagine they have," Clara said. Cecilia turned from the window. "What exactly do you believe you are doing, Clara?" "I was attending a drawing room, Cecilia. As I was invited to do." "You were performing," Cecilia said, her composure thinner than it had been in the linen room. "Attaching yourself to a man whose attention you have deliberately cultivated, in full view of people who will speak of nothing else for a fortnight, on the eve of my wedding, when any disruption to my household's reputation." "Your household?" Clara said. Something in her own voice surprised her. It was quiet. It was entirely steady. And it had an edge in it she had never heard herself produce before. Cecilia stopped. "Sit down, Clara," her mother said sharply. "I would prefer to stand." Clara turned to face her mother fully. "I found the letters, Mamma. In Father's writing desk. The letters from Mr. Calloway, which were addressed to me and never delivered. And the solicitor's correspondence regarding Grandmother's bequest." The fire crackled. Nobody spoke. £400, Clara continued, in the same quiet, steady voice. "Left to me specifically. Transferred into the household account. Authorized under your signature." She paused. "I believe it paid for Cecilia's debut gown. The gold silk one." Her mother's expression did not collapse. It simply set. Like plaster hardening. "The family's circumstances required." "My circumstances required it more," Clara said. "I was the one it was left to." "You are being dramatic." "I am being honest." Clara felt the anger beneath her, clean and structural, holding her upright rather than overwhelming her. "I have been useful to this family my entire life. I have managed, and mended, and made do, and I have done it without complaint because I believed it was circumstance. I now understand it was a decision. Repeatedly made. On my behalf. Without my knowledge." Cecilia opened her mouth. "I am not finished." Clara looked at her sister, directly, without flinching. "You will not tell me again where I belong. You lost that authority the moment you introduced me to the Duke of Kingston as hired help." The room was completely silent. Her mother looked at her as though seeing a piece of furniture rearrange itself without assistance. "I am going to bed," Clara said. "Good night." She left the door open behind her. He came to the garden gate at 4 o'clock, as his note had asked her to. It was a small note, delivered that morning by his man, 3 lines, correct and careful, requesting a brief private word at her convenience. Clara had read it twice, folded it, and placed it in the drawer where she now kept the letters she did not intend to lose. She was there before him. She stood at the garden gate with her shawl pulled close against the October chill, watching the lane, and told herself that the feeling in her chest was merely the cold. He arrived on foot, without attendance, as had become his habit when he came to her. She had noticed that, how he stripped away the apparatus of his rank when he sought her out, as though he understood instinctively that it stood between them and he preferred the conversation to the ceremony. "Miss Ashford." He removed his hat. "Thank you for coming." "Your note suggested some urgency," she said. "It suggested importance," he corrected gently. "Which is a different thing." They walked along the garden path in the way they had fallen into over the past weeks, side by side, unhurried, with the ease of 2 people who have discovered they think better in each other's company. "Cecilia's wedding is tomorrow," he said. "I am aware," Clara said. "I pressed her veil this morning." He stopped walking, turned to face her. "I want you to attend as my guest," he said. "Not as your sister's assistant. Not standing at the back. Beside me, Miss Ashford. As you ought to have been at the engagement dinner and every occasion before it." Clara looked at him. The late afternoon light was pale and level, and in it his expression was entirely unguarded, no performance, no social calculation, only the simple directness she had come to understand was simply who he was. "Your Grace," she said carefully. "You understand what that will mean. What people will say. What my family." "I know precisely what it will mean," he said. "I am asking whether you do. And whether, knowing it, you will come anyway." The garden was quiet around them. Somewhere beyond the wall the lane was empty, the county going about its Friday afternoon, entirely unaware that Clara Ashford was standing at a gate being asked to choose between the life she had always accepted and something she had not yet allowed herself to name. She thought of the letters in her drawer. The gold silk gown. The dark muslin she had worn to serve dishes while her sisters wore pearls. She thought of what it had cost her to be sensible. To be self-sufficient. To say "I am very glad for you" and mean approximately half of it. "Yes," she said. "I will come." Something moved across his face, relief, she thought, and something warmer than relief. "Then I will see you tomorrow, Miss Ashford," he said quietly. "Beside me. Where you belong." She heard the murmur begin at the church door. It moved through the assembled guests the way sound moves through water, outward from the source in small, unstoppable rings. Clara felt it without looking. She kept her eyes forward, her hand resting lightly on the Duke of Kingston's arm, and walked into St. Michael's Church with her spine straight and her dark blue gown, her best, carefully pressed the night before, doing its quiet, dignified work. Beside her the Duke walked with his customary unhurried composure, acknowledging greetings with brief nods, his bearing communicating without words that this was entirely unremarkable and anyone who found it otherwise was welcome to their opinion. They took their seats for rows from the front. She felt her mother's gaze find her from across the aisle like a cold hand on the back of her neck. She did not turn. When Cecilia appeared at the church door on Lord Harwick's arm, radiant in ivory and lace, her eye swept the assembled guests with the instinctive survey of a woman who has always known exactly who is in a room. They found Clara. For 3 full seconds Cecilia was entirely still. Then Lord Harwick murmured something, and she began to walk, and her smile returned, somewhat reduced, Clara thought, from its original wattage. The ceremony was beautiful. Clara listened to it properly, which she had not expected. The words about devotion and faithfulness landed differently when one was sitting beside a man who had sought her out in a darkened dining room, found her at a market, walked with her in a garden, and asked her to stand beside him in full view of everyone who had ever looked through her. Afterward, on the church steps in the pale November sun, her mother appeared. Clara. Her voice was measured. Recalibrated. The voice of a woman reassessing a situation with impressive speed. You look very well this morning. Thank you, Mama. Her mother's eyes moved to the Duke, who stood nearby in conversation with Lord Harwick. Then back to Clara. Something moved through her expression that was not quite shame and not quite pride and contained elements of both. Perhaps, her mother said carefully, we might have you join us for dinner next week. Properly. At the table. Clara looked at her for a long moment. Perhaps, she said. Then the Duke was at her side, and he offered his arm, and she took it, and they walked down the church steps together into the cold clean morning while the county watched and drew its conclusions. Cecilia passed them on the steps. She met Clara's eyes for exactly 1 second, and in that second Clara saw something she had not expected. Not fury. Not malice. Something more complicated and considerably more honest than either. Then Cecilia was past them, and Lord Harwick was handing her into the carriage, and the moment was gone. Are you well? The Duke asked quietly, as they reached the lane. Clara considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. The morning was cold. The sky was pale silver. Somewhere behind her the carriage wheels were turning, carrying her sister toward a life that had been planned and purchased and arranged with great precision. Ahead of her was something she could not yet fully see. Only feel, new and unsteady and entirely her own. Yes, Your Grace, she said. I believe I am. He looked at her with that expression she had first seen across a candlelit dinner table, quiet, direct, certain. Kingston, he said. I believe you have earned the right to call me Kingston. Clara allowed herself, at last, a full and unguarded smile. Then you had better call me Clara, she said. And they walked on together into the morning.